Well, the phrase doubting Thomas is a part of our culture. Even people who have no idea who Thomas was have no idea where the phrase comes from, are still familiar with that phrase, doubting Thomas. If somebody's a skeptic, if they never want to believe anything, if they're always demanding more proof, we refer to them as a doubting Thomas. But as I read that story, it seems to me that Thomas has kind of gotten a bum rap here. Yes, he had doubts, but really, if you look at it, he had no more doubts than any of the other disciples did. And yet we've come to read this story as Jesus criticizing Thomas for his lack of faith. And I think when we read the story that way, not only are we being unfair to poor old Thomas, but I think we miss a valuable lesson that can come from this story. Now, the Bible verses pick up exactly where we left off last week. In the morning, that first Easter morning, Jesus had appeared to Mary Magdalene. She had told the disciples, she has seen the Lord. And now it's evening. The disciples are in a locked room out of fear of being arrested. Jesus appears to them. He says, "Peace be with you." He shows them his hands where the nails had been pounded through, his side that was pierced by a sword. The disciples are overjoyed. Jesus breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." So all of the disciples believe that Jesus is alive, except for Thomas. He was not there when Jesus came. We don't know why, don't know where he was, but he was not there. And the disciples tell him about Jesus being alive, but he says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." So a week passes. The disciples are all back in that same locked room, and this time Thomas is there. Jesus again appears to them, says, "Peace be with you." He shows Thomas his hands where the nails had been pounded through and his side that was pierced by a sword. And this time Thomas is overjoyed. But do you see why I say Thomas got a bum rap here? What Jesus showed Thomas was exactly the same thing that he had shown the other disciples when he came there the first time. When Thomas was not there, Jesus had shown the other disciples his hands where the nails had been and his side that was pierced. None of them believed he was alive before they saw that either. Thomas did not ask for any more proof than any of the others had gotten. He did not get any more proof than any of the others had gotten. And yet poor old Thomas is the one who always gets criticized. Thomas is the one whose faith is said to be weaker than the others. Thomas is the one who for 2,000 years has been called the doubter, whose very name has been turned into a negative. It just does not seem very fair. But of course, you know why we look at it that way. It's because of what Jesus said. After Jesus shows Thomas his hands and his side, Jesus says to Thomas, "Stop doubting and believe." And then he says, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." It really does seem, when you read that, like Jesus singled out poor old Thomas for criticism. But I was thinking about this. That first time when Jesus appeared to the other disciples without Thomas, why do you suppose Jesus did that? I mean, I assume Jesus would have known Thomas was not there. Why would Jesus choose to appear then? Surely there must have been some other time that Jesus could have appeared to the disciples, sometime when they were all going to be there. It's almost like that first time Jesus deliberately excluded Thomas. Why would Jesus do that? Could have been just a coincidence, I suppose. It could be that this was just the time that Jesus needed to appear to the disciples. Whoever was there, whoever was not, was not. But I doubt that. It's possible. It's just hard for me to believe that Jesus would have left something like this to chance. It seems like there must have been some reason why Jesus appeared to the others without Thomas being there. And I wonder if, just maybe, the reason could have been that Jesus thought Thomas might have enough faith to not need to see for himself. I wonder if perhaps the reason Jesus appeared to the disciples without Thomas there is that Jesus actually thought out of all the disciples, Thomas might be the only one who had enough faith to not need to see for himself. Out of all the disciples, Thomas just might be the one who could believe without seeing. When we look at it that way, It looks like Jesus thought Thomas was the disciple who had the most faith and not the least. And Jesus' words to Thomas then are not so much a criticism as they are just kind of an expression of disappointment. Not that it was wrong for Thomas to want to see for himself, really. It was just that Jesus was hoping that maybe Thomas had enough faith to not need to. But here's what I think is the real point out of all this. Jesus appears to the disciples without Thomas. They all believe. Thomas does not. So what does Jesus do? Jesus comes back. Jesus comes back. Specifically, he comes back for Thomas. Jesus specifically comes back so that Thomas can see and can believe. Think about that. Now, the 12 disciples, originally 12, they're down to 11 now because Judas is gone. 10 out of the 11 believed. That's 91%. That's a pretty good batting average, right? But Jesus was not going to settle for that. Jesus wanted each and every one of his disciples to believe. And he was not going to give up until each and every one of his disciples did believe. As long as there was even one disciple who did not, Jesus was going to do whatever it took to make that one disciple believe. Each and every one of his disciples was that important to Jesus. And each and every one of us is that important to Jesus too. Because most of us do have doubts at one time or another. We may try to hide them from others. We may try not to think about them. But we still have them. It may seem like everybody around us in church believes and we're the only one who has those doubts. But we still have them. We might wish we did not have them. For all we know, Thomas might have wished that he did not have those doubts. But the doubts are still there. Jesus does not want us to go on with our doubts. Jesus wants us to believe, and Jesus is not going to give up until we do believe. Even if one of us was the only person on earth who had those doubts, that would not matter to Jesus. As long as there is just one of us who does not believe, Jesus is going to do whatever it takes to get that one to believe. Each and every one of us is that important to Jesus. But the thing is, you're not the only one who has doubts. Lots of us do. Some of the greatest Christians in the world have confessed to having doubts at one time or another. Mother Teresa said she had doubts. Billy Graham has said he had doubts. A lot of us are in the position of the fellow that Jesus talks to in Mark chapter 9. Maybe you remember this story. A man asks Jesus if he can heal his son. And Jesus says, "What do you mean, if I can heal him?" Jesus says, "Everything's possible for one who believes." And the man responds, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." That's the position we're in a lot of times. We believe and yet we don't. We believe and yet we have doubts. And Jesus understands that. Jesus understood the disciples' unbelief. He understood Thomas's doubts. But Jesus did not want them to stay in unbelief and doubt. Jesus wanted them to believe. And Jesus did everything he could to help them believe. Now, it'd be nice if Jesus would appear right before us, just as he did with Thomas and the other disciples. Of course, Jesus could do that. Jesus could do anything, but for most of us, it probably won't work that way. But that does not mean that the Lord has abandoned us, because if we look around us, we can see God at work in all kinds of ways. If we look at our own lives, we can see God at work in all kinds of ways too. I don't know what those ways are for you. Here's just a few of them for me. God was at work when, coming out of law school, I took a job in Pierre rather than one in Lorenz, Iowa. God was at work when, without us even knowing each other, Wanda moved into an apartment directly across from mine. God was at work when, out of the blue, we got a call offering us a chance to move to Wessington Springs. God was at work when, through a series of events that takes far too long to go into now, we felt God calling us to go into ministry. And I believe God was at work when the Dakotas Conference sent us here to this parish. And if you think about your own lives, I suspect you can think of some of those moments too. Those moments when God was at work in your life, even if you did not know it at the time. Those coincidences that just all lined up perfectly for things to happen the way they did. That's God at work. That's Jesus doing whatever it takes to make us stop doubting and believe. It's Jesus doing whatever it takes. It's Jesus saying to us what he said to Thomas, stop doubting and believe. So it's okay if we have doubts. But let's not just stay stuck in our doubts. Let's look for all those times in our lives when God has shown up. Let's look for the times when God is showing up right now, leading us and guiding us, both as individuals and as a church. Let's look for all the ways that Jesus is saying to us, stop doubting and believe. Our doubts are real, but God is more real. If we trust God, if we look for the ways God is at work, God will give us the faith we need to overcome our doubts and our unbelief. Amen.